I mean, it's an interesting one because it's not an epic. It's a slice of life over 3 or 4 hours. Maybe not even that. It's almost played in real time. Herod has a nice dinner and far too much to drink and lusts after his stepdaughter, who herself has been lusting in her 16-year-old way after this bearded prophet John the Baptist down in the dungeon. And the whole thing is played, as I say, in a period of a couple of hours. But it's in a sense, there's a funny parallel with David Hare's play The Judas Kiss, where David took 2 particular incidents in Oscar's life, that moment before he's arrested and the moment in Naples 2 years later when Bosie, his young lover, leaves him. And we don't know what happened at that point, but David injected his imagination into it and created a play out of it. And I think in the same way Oscar, knew the biblical story, but he was going to say, right, okay, now there's 2 hours and I have to fill those 2 hours with something which is plausible and dark and deep and really very uncomfortable. And that's precisely what he did. So exactly, in a way, the opposite of an epic.
And how much of it do you find is the original biblical story and how much of it is Oscar, or do they overlay each other almost continuously?
Oh gosh, I think it would require a religious specialist to tell you that. But I do remember looking into it some years ago and discovering that there was a mythical story about Salome, who escaped being beheaded by her stepfather for behaving in the way that she did, and wandered across Europe and found herself somewhere in Eastern Europe in the winter, fell through the ice on the river, and an ice floe came along and severed her head, which was rather a nice... whether that's true or not, I don't know. But
what do you think the appeal of this story is for people who don't know their Bibles at all? Because that's increasingly common.
It's a pretty grisly story. I mean, obviously there are parallels with Oscar's own life in a strange way. If you transpose the roles of Herod and Salome and John the Baptist into Oscar and young Alfred Douglas and Douglas's father, what you see is Douglas dancing for Oscar, and as a result, being Oscar finding himself asked for the head of Bosie's father, who he detested, on a silver platter. And the consequences of that, we know. He finished up in prison. But I've lost the first part of your story there.
So what are you hoping that the audiences will gain? Because it's not, in some ways, people, because it doesn't have the big budget or the CGI, it may not appeal to certain audiences, but it really should because of the stories overlaying. What would you say to people who are even thinking about?
Well, it's obviously not a mass distribution movie. It's a movie which is beautifully acted. That's to say, the film of the play itself. Those who are fascinated by Al Pacino will find extraordinary insights in the second movie, The Wilde Salome, which is Al's voyage to discover Oscar and what made Oscar tick and what made him behave as he did. I think that it's a film which will... It's one of those films, I think, I'd hesitate to call it an art film because that puts it down on an even lower level. It's a very artistic film, and particularly for audiences who don't know that side of Oscar Wilde, they'll see that there is a more thoughtful, a deeper, a perhaps more uncomfortable side to Oscar Wilde, which he did his best to hide, obviously. And it's something, too, which didn't really come out until the 1960s, when his letters were published, quite literally warts and all, and people then discovered that behind this almost cardboard funny man, there was somebody who was thoughtful and who was actually had quite an extraordinary personality. Okay, pleasure.